3 days before the storm even had a name, Walter Finch already sensed it coming. He stood at the edge of his garden at dawn, studying a strange stillness in the air, boots damp with early dew. This season, Walter Finch had planted something no gardener in the valley understood. Tall rows of sunflowers and sorghum towered over his lower beds of peppers and tomatoes, forming a living canopy few had ever seen used this way. His neighbor Roy Callahan leaned over the fence, chuckling. "That's not a garden, Walter, that's a cornfield salad," he said, staring at the tangled mix of tall stalks crowding Walter Finch's neat vegetable rows below. Word spread through the valley fast. Farmers gathered at the co-op, joking about Walter Finch wasting good soil on a jungle of sunflowers instead of clean, disciplined rows like everyone else had always grown. Across the valley, the other gardens stood open and exposed, low rows of peppers and tomatoes under a bright, cloudless summer sky that gave no warning of what was building far to the west. The evening weather bulletin crackled with urgency. A powerful supercell was forming over the ridge, capable of producing large, damaging hail within hours, an unusual and violent threat for this time of summer. Roy Callahan and the other farmers shrugged off the warning. They had heard hail watches before that came to nothing, and trusted their open fields and clear skies to see the storm pass harmlessly by. Walter Finch spent the evening checking stakes and ties along his sunflower rows, tightening loose twine, and making sure every tall stalk stood firm before the wind and clouds began rolling in. By late afternoon, the sky over the valley turned a sickly shade of green, thick black clouds churning low and fast, a deep rumble rolling across the fields as the temperature dropped sharply. The first hailstones tore into Roy Callahan's exposed pepper rows within minutes, shredding leaves and stripping stems bare, white ice piling rapidly across the open, undefended rows of his garden. Beneath Walter Finch's tall sunflower canopy, the hail bounced harmlessly off broad leaves and thick stalks, the sound muffled and distant, his sheltered pepper plants barely stirring under the pounding storm above. A hail gauge nailed to a fence post filled rapidly with jagged white stones the size of marbles, the valley's radar glowing an alarming shade of red on a laptop screen inside a nearby farmhouse. Inside his battered greenhouse, Roy Callahan stood frozen, listening to hail hammering the metal roof like gunfire, dents forming with every impact, the noise deafening in the sudden violent darkness. Walter Finch crouched low beneath his sunflower canopy, checking pepper after pepper with careful hands, each one still firm, unbruised, and completely untouched by the storm raging just above the leaves. When the hail finally stopped, neighbors stepped outside to survey the damage, murmuring in disbelief, glancing uneasily toward Walter Finch's rows, where, somehow, everything still looked impossibly green and whole. Walter Finch walked his rows slowly afterward, unhurried, checking stem after stem with the calm of a man who had already done everything that mattered long before the storm ever arrived. Walter Finch remembered his grandmother's old saying, spoken decades earlier, that the tall must guard the small, a simple lesson the whole valley was now painfully learning for the first time. Across the valley, entire gardens lay shredded and flattened, torn leaves and broken stems scattered across ground still white with melting hail, an entire season's work destroyed within 20 violent minutes. Beneath Walter Finch's canopy, the peppers and tomatoes hung whole and vibrant, completely undamaged, their tall sunflower guardians standing bent but unbroken above them in the sudden stillness after the storm. Curious neighbors began drifting toward Walter Finch's fence line, no longer laughing, simply staring at rows of untouched, healthy vegetables surrounded by a valley of shredded, hail-battered gardens. A weathered shed wall held Walter Finch's neatly organized stakes, twine, and seed packets, each one worn smooth from years of quiet, careful preparation for storms just like this one. Without a word of pride, Walter Finch simply lifted a broad sunflower leaf, letting his neighbors see the untouched peppers sheltered safely beneath it through the entire violent hailstorm. From the ridge above the valley, the aerial view told the whole story. Walter Finch's tall green canopy stood like a single defiant island inside a sea of shredded, hail-flattened gardens. Slowly, the mood in the valley shifted from open mockery into something heavier and quieter, an unspoken respect nobody wanted to admit out loud, but everyone now clearly felt. Roy Callahan was the first to walk over, cap in hand, asking quietly what exactly Walter Finch had done differently, unable to hide the exhaustion still written across his face. Walter Finch didn't gloat. He simply handed Roy Callahan a handful of sunflower seeds and explained exactly where to plant them to shelter his rows before the next big storm. Days later, clear skies finally settled fully over the valley, and Walter Finch's sheltered peppers and tomatoes ripened quickly in the warm sun, the danger of the storm now safely behind them. The whole valley slowly began cleaning up, farmers sorting through broken stems and bruised produce under gentler skies, grateful that at least the worst of the violent weather had passed. Walter Finch stood quietly among his tall sunflowers, watching bees drift steadily between blossoms, his whole garden humming softly with a season that had somehow survived completely intact against the odds. Harvest day finally arrived, and Walter Finch's baskets filled with unblemished peppers and tomatoes, smooth and whole, a striking contrast to the bruised, scarred produce scattered around the valley. Roy Callahan and the neighboring farmers sorted through their damaged rows quietly, setting aside bruised, misshapen vegetables, the true cost of a season spent trusting open air over careful shelter. Walter Finch's roadside stand filled steadily with crates of fresh, unblemished produce, his weathered hands moving with the same unhurried rhythm he had kept since that violent afternoon in midsummer. That autumn, for the first time in memory, farmers from across the valley walked up Walter Finch's lane, asking to learn the methods they had once mocked so freely. Walter Finch spread handfuls of sunflower and sorghum seeds across an old wooden table, explaining patiently, without a trace of resentment, how shelter and patience had outlasted exposure and panic. Walter Finch walked Roy Callahan through his rows, showing exactly how the tall sunflower canopy absorbed the force of falling hail, while sheltering the delicate vegetables growing safely beneath it. The community planted a small shared demonstration row near the co-op, tall sunflowers and sorghum stalks that nobody in the valley had ever bothered to grow before that violent summer. As the sun set behind the ridge, long golden light spilled across Walter Finch's garden, his silhouette standing quietly among tall sunflowers, heavy with seed, that had refused to fall. Walter Finch hung his tools back on their pegs inside the shed. Each one returned to its familiar place, the quiet ritual of another honest day's work completed. Children from town began following Walter Finch through his rows, asking endless questions about sunflowers, shelter, and storms, curious about lessons their own fathers had never once taught them. Word of Walter Finch's surviving harvest spread far beyond the valley's borders, drawing quiet visits from younger gardeners eager to understand what patience and shelter could actually accomplish. Walter Finch never once said he had told them so. He simply kept walking his garden at dawn, checking stems and leaves the same patient way he always had. By the following summer, gardens all across the valley had begun planting their own tall sunflower rows. The exact way Walter Finch had quietly shown them was possible. The camera pulls back over the valley at dusk, Walter Finch walking a quiet path between his tall sunflowers, the garden around him finally settling into a season of quiet renewal.